Do you want me to? Good. Somebody come on a microphone.
Right, I can operate a screw thread is what I can do. Yeah, thank you for being so hospitable and being part of the blessing that I've received over these last 3 months. I think the first thing I probably need to do is just to confess that the reason I didn't say anything, and I think I've explained this to Tony very much when I first came here, was that I didn't want to sort of come here under the banner of coming somewhere for a sabbatical and then deciding that this was really a place that I felt so uncomfortable I had to be somewhere else, and you feeling really hurt about it. So that's why I didn't say anything at the beginning. But as time has gone on, then I felt more and more at home here, and so leaving here is going to be quite difficult for me in some ways. It's going to be nice to go back to where I've come from, just as it'll be exciting to move on to Inverness. But the blessing that I've received here has been really wonderful. So I want to thank you and praise God for that, because that's been really good. My testimony is one that sort of starts before where I'm going to begin from, and I'll explain that in a moment. But in a fortnight's time, some of you have given up being in front of the square box watching the Grand Prix. In a fortnight's time, we will be celebrating our 21st wedding anniversary. So the day before the British Grand Prix, 21 years ago, we got married. I can remember it that clearly because there was a chance at the time that I could have got tickets to the pits, because somebody who I was working with was promising me these. They never came through, so Kim was spared the first day of honeymoon being spent in the pits at Silverstone. So we had a nice quiet drive up as the cars were going round and round in circles up to Yorkshire, where the rest of our honeymoon was going to be. So that was quite an easy time to travel. But I am somebody who, in some people's eyes, I'm an adulterer because I'm on my second marriage. And I've been married once before, separated from my wife after about 4.5 years of marriage, and then sometime later met Kim. So it's nothing at all to do, we just separated, things weren't working out. And a while of being with Kim, and we decided that we wanted to get married. Now, if I'm being totally honest about it, for me that wasn't something which was sort of the highest thing on my agenda, because I'd already been through one marriage, made promises for life, and then things hadn't worked out and broken them. So I thought, well, what's it really all about? But it was important for Kim, and it was important also that we got married in church. But we knew, because she went to church with her mum at the time to one of the local Church of England churches, we knew that we couldn't get married in church, at least at the church that Kim and her mum went to, because on the odd occasions when I've been, I need to tell you, by the way, that this time I was an atheist, fully signed up atheist. The odd times that I've been, because I didn't mind singing the songs, then on 2 of those occasions I can remember the vicar talking against people remarrying after they've been divorced, and that the church just wouldn't do that. So we got the message loud and clear, and so went to the Methodist minister who lived next door but one to Kim's mum, and he agreed to marry us. And so I thought I would go along just to check out whether this guy was normal. Now, there are 2 reasons for that. One is that we'd also rung at that time the URC minister, who'd said, well, maybe you ought to come along to church a couple of times, because we may not be what you're expecting. So immediately alarm bells, what sort of weird church is this? And the first time I got married, the vicar was very much like Larry Grayson, and it was very difficult to take the whole service Seriously, because you're just expecting him to say something like, shut that door, or look in here. For those people that are old enough to remember Larry Grayson, there are one or two blank faces. I forget how old I am sometimes. But, so I wanted to check whether the minister was normal. And being a fully signed up atheist, I had no problem in doing that, because why should I be scared of going to church? If God doesn't exist, then it's not a problem. And so I just went, and it was just after Christmas. We'd been to see him at the beginning of December. I thought, I'll not go when all the Christmas stuff is going on, because that won't be normal either, the Christmas stuff. So I went just after Christmas, and what I didn't realise was that they'd just been out to Romania. This is going back 21 years, to take a load of stuff, as everybody was doing that sort of thing in those days. And what he came back with on this particular Sunday was, rather than give a sermon in the way that he normally would, he came back with 3 slots of him telling stories of what had happened on this journey. He told stories about how they'd been going through one checkpoint and every single vehicle was thoroughly checked, and they were really frightened about what was going to happen to them, but theirs was just way through, and they never understood why. He told stories about how other things had happened on the journey, which he said were incidences of God working in or through what they were doing. And I was really confused, because here I was, an atheist, hearing this story, which sounded like it should be, in my mind, just a load of coincidences. And this man claiming that it's God acting in and through what they were doing, and I just knew that it was true, that he was saying these things in this way. And I just couldn't understand that. Now, I committed to go to church that Sunday, and then when we came back in about 6 months' time to get married. And the very fact that I'm stood here today is a continuation of that trip to Romania, in a way, because it all sort of leads out one story, and if anything else, tell your stories, because telling our stories, we are story-rich people, is part of how we actually make those contact points with other people's lives, because there's things that people relate to. So I went the next week, and I went the week after that, and this was a real sort of crunch point, because we knew from what the notices said at the beginning, they had printed notices, that it was going to be communion that Sunday. And I knew from going to church with Kim and her mum that that meant that that did not include me. Because when I'd been to the Church of England, they'd always said that communion was for communicants or communicating members of other churches, and if you were neither of those, you were to bring an order of service with you to the front, this piece of paper, and then you would receive a blessing. And I will confess, I was sent to Sunday school as a child. My mum and dad used to send us off. They didn't go to church, and Dad would pick us up afterwards. I wasn't really quite sure, although I've probably got a better understanding now of what they might have been doing with us out of the house. There were 4 of us. But at around the age of 10, I decided I didn't want to go anymore, and that was that. And then I moved gradually from that into the atheism, which I managed to sort of fully develop in my teens. So seeing this display of people being invited to go to the front with pieces of paper in their hand, just to me reminded me of the stories that I could remember of lepers being given bells or signs around their necks, or however the story was told, saying that they were unclean. Because to carry this piece of paper said to me, and I just knew, even as an atheist, that there was something wrong with this, that it was saying that you're not welcome, or you're not good enough, or however it goes. And in the service that was the 3rd service after this first encounter with God, we were sort of sitting at the back of the church, because we were sitting at the back of the church on this Sunday, and we were nudging each other, and I was saying, well, what are you going to do? And she said, well, I'm not going if you're not going. So I said, but you can go, I can't go. She said, well, I'm not going without you. And all this was going on in the lead up to the thing. And then the invitation came. The invitation came simply that it was for anybody who wants to accept Jesus' invitation. And I just knew, even though I'd heard all the other stuff, that that was me. Now, I wasn't at the point when I would have done such a thing, and certainly the church was a church that didn't act in that way either. But in my heart, I felt like it's going, that's me! But I just sat there and waited the turn to be invited by the steward, and off we processed. And for me then, my conversion experience is that first encounter on the Sunday when I just went to check out the man, and the third Sunday when I actually properly encountered Jesus and his invitation for me to enter into his life. And Kim at that point thought she was marrying a nice, safe atheist. So I think I probably was nice, just about. And she ended up being a minister's wife. She never ever would have imagined. Now, part of what I wanted to share today was this sense of all of us being created for a purpose. There's a prayer which I sometimes use at funerals, which is part of the prayers that are set out in the Methodist worship book. And I must admit, in funerals, because I'm so frightened of getting a number of things wrong, particularly with people that I don't know either at all or not very well, that a lot of the structure of the service I tend to use what's in the worship book, because that provides a framework. So if it doesn't sound very sort of spiritual that I use written prayers, in those occasions I do. And there's this prayer, which is one of the optional ones at the end, which says that God has made nothing in vain, and he loves all that he has made. And it then talks about looking on your bereaved servants. And I think part of the purpose of the prayer is to say that whatever may be sort of really ordinary about this person who's died, that actually God has made nothing in vain. Because I meet so many people who say, oh well, you know, there was just an ordinary moment, they were always there, and that's about all they can say about the person who's just died. And part of the ministry of leading a service is to give value to the people that are there, because whoever's gone is gone, but how they connect with who's gone is important, and how they live on the rest of their lives is important as well. And so it's part of attaching value to who's died in their eyes, but also saying that there is a purpose for them as well in their ordinariness, because lots of us think we're just ordinary and we're not important, and we could sort of pass through this world and it's as if we were never there, and there's no purpose. But God does have a purpose for us. I think it's really important that we hear that, because he has, as it says in the prayer, and I thoroughly believe, he has made nothing in vain, and he loves all that he has made. And if he's made nothing in vain, then he's got a purpose for us. And sometimes we spend a lot of our lives not listening to and missing that. Now, going back to when I was a child, and just after the time that I'd stopped going to Sunday school, and actually, Colin, just hearing your tuppence a service choir boy story reminded me that I was plagued by the choir in the church that I was sent to Sunday school at, because they were desperate to get me in the choir, because they thought I could sing, but I didn't want any of it, so I never got the tuppence. The wedding fees were mentioned, by the way. 2 and 6, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's
yes. Right. Yeah. Even that didn't induce me. I still didn't want to do it. But after the Sunday school time, I was in the Scouts, and if there was a parade service, we were actually attached to a Methodist church, although most of the time you could actually miss the connection at all. But we used to go occasionally to parade services, and if there was a requirement for somebody from a uniformed organisation to read, then I was the person who was asked to read on behalf of the Cub Scouts and using the brownies and guides as well, because I could read well in church, and everybody else basically didn't want to do it, and I quite liked doing it. And I can remember what seemed to me at the time, although they probably were less old than I'm giving them credit for, old ladies afterwards saying, "Oh, you make a nice minister when you grow up." And I thought that was sort of a reasonable thing, as it was a job to do, but I wasn't really taking a lot of notice of it. Now I look back and think, well, maybe they were actually seeing more than just this nice lad who could read in church. Some years later, and whilst I was in my first marriage, I was involved in a head-on collision on the motorway. I was driving, just coming onto the bottom of the M3, and this car was coming down the other way. Except I didn't know it was coming down the other way. We were going over the flyover, if you know the bottom of the M3, which links to the M27, and I was following another car which was following the truck, and there were two other trucks that we were overtaking. And as the truck in front of us pulled over, after it had gone past us, it had gone over the slope, we started to accelerate. The other car then braked fiercely and went over to the left, and I thought, what on earth is going on, until they moved enough for me to see that there was a car coming straight towards me. Now, I had cuts from the glass that went into my face, and but I wasn't really hurt. I just filled the car up with petrol as well, and the petrol tank burst, but nothing ignited. The car was a write-off. And what I need to tell you about that experience is that even though I was an atheist then, I just had a real sense that I hadn't died for a purpose. But I had no way of actually being able to interpret or express that. I just had this real deep sense. And I think those sorts of things, when you look back on life, are all part of calling, and how God has a purpose for us, because nothing that He has made, nothing that He has breathed life into, and I do believe that He breathes life into us all, it's what we do with that life then that is the issue, but He has made nothing in vain. And still I was ignoring this purpose until I had this call really placed on my life on that first encounter, and the call that's been placed on my life in various ways ever since. I have a very firm conviction that if you do feel that God is placing a call on your life, although there are some exceptions, it's usually for now. If He's calling you now, it's because it's now that He's calling you. I meet several people who will put off doing things for quite some time until it suits them before they finally answer God's call. And I just have a real sense that God sometimes gets really frustrated with that. We've got a treasurer in the church in Shanklin. If you know anything about the Methodist Church in Shanklin, you know exactly who I'm talking about. She's been treasurer for 3 years now, but I spent 3 years in front of church council saying that our treasurer, who thought he'd served for 20 years, but actually when he checked back he found he'd served for 30 years being church treasurer, was desperate to give it up. You can guess he was well into his 70s when we first had that conversation. And I'd spent 3 years saying, well, we need a new treasurer, and finally I got to the stage of, well, he is definitely going to retire when the reports are done at the end of this financial year, and once he's completed those reports, if nobody else is going to do it, then I will do it, and you will have to explain to the rest of the Methodist Church why I'm not doing other things that I could be doing instead of being treasurer. And And finally, this woman, who is now our treasurer, and she's quite open about this, so I'm not telling any stories, she said, well, I've heard you say that for 3 years now, and each time I felt God telling me to do it, and finally I've realised that I've got to listen to him. And so I think sometimes we do, we put things off. I know other people who have sort of been busy with their lives and felt that God was putting a call on their lives, and they were being asked to do things when it wasn't really convenient for them, and they were putting things off. And I think actually for the Lord, that gets really frustrating. One of the things that has really touched me here is how there is this sense of change and moving on, and with the 1 o'clock service and other things, just wanting to move forward with the Lord, wanting to join in with what he's doing, and actually taking the attitude of, well, we need to be getting on with this and just seeing how it goes. Some things work, some things don't, but it's somebody really wants to get in touch with the church, don't they? But it's really important that that you do actually join in with what God's doing sometimes. A year ago, I knew that I was going to be asked a question which I thought I knew the answer to some time before, because the Methodist process is quite slow. A year ago, I would be asked whether I would be prepared to offer any more time here on the Isle of Wight. I knew that the answer was that God was calling me to do something different. I just didn't know what it was. And it actually took until November to find out that Inverness was even on the agenda. We enter into a process which is called stationing, which I won't bore you with, but the upshot of it is for those people that are going through the process, there were last autumn a list of 137 appointments that will be coming up for change this summer, and all we get is a PDF that comes through, and we get to look through the list and work out where we might be wanting to go to. Now, sad to say that for some Methodist ministers, for all sorts of reasons, and I can understand why people live in the way that they do, I don't necessarily agree with it, but they will put quite sort of tight parameters on where they are prepared to look at. I can understand and say there's practical reasons. We don't have children, which is a sadness in one way but is a blessing in another, because at least we're free to sort of do things that we wouldn't be able to do otherwise, in just go to Inverness and not actually sort of have to worry about it too much, is one. But some people could put quite tight parameters. When I was first talking to our district chairman, who's the sort of the regional person who has oversight for the Methodist Church in this part of the country, he was saying that I ought to put on my parameters that I didn't want to go to Cornwall or West Wales or Scotland, he said. Quite why he had to hang up on those places. I'm not sure what. I said, I'm an itinerant minister, I'm called to go where God and the church is going to place me. So he said, well, I really think you ought to sort of limit things a bit, because otherwise you could end up going to those places. And the list came out, and Kim and I agreed to look through and pray through the list separately, and we came up with lists of where we felt might be good places to go, and none of her list included Scotland, because she assumed that I wouldn't want to go to Scotland either. And Inverness just really sort of shone out, and there were 2 places that were on this list, and one of them was Inverness, the other one was St Albans, and in my humanity I felt that Inverness might be too much of a big step, particularly for Kim, because it would mean leaving her remaining family. And so we prayed through it some more, talked to the district chairman, and there's just something in all of this that was saying that we could, if we felt we wanted to gamble, say, well, we'll take Inverness off our shortlist because we were asked to produce a shortlist of 5, and we could leave St Albans, which was the other one that said to be sort of a really strong pull on, and then if we didn't get St Albans, because people are not likely to want to go to Inverness, we still might get a second bite at Inverness later. But it just really felt that in everything that we were doing, the Lord was saying to us that we can't take Inverness off the list. And we knew that if we left it on, as sure as anything in this life is certain, it was certain that that's what we were going to be offered. And so we left it on, that's what we were offered, and Kim was really worried about it. Because although she'd said yes to leave it on there, when the reality came to actually sort of go up there, it was an awfully long way in November to actually go and have a look at the appointment. But as soon as we went up, she just had such a peace on her heart that actually this is what we were meant to do. And so that's why we're going. Now, last week when I thought I was going to be saying a little bit about this, less than I've said today, I actually brought a newspaper in with me which I put down somewhere and then couldn't find the rest of Sunday last week. It just disappeared. It was the Saturday copy of the Times, and because lots of people have been saying things about Inverness, and on the front page on Saturday's Times last week was a picture which had been taken the day before of a man skiing in a kilt in the Nevis resort area, so it's not that far from Inverness, in June. The photograph had been taken the day before. So there he was in what looked like a blizzard, skiing in his kilt. And we want to go to Inverness. The other picture that I wanted to bring in, which was earlier on in the week, and I actually copied it onto a file, but then forgot to bring the memory stick today. I'm always forgetting to take memory sticks somewhere. Was a picture of dolphins, because there's a pod of about 300 dolphins that inhabit the environs around Inverness, and between the Moray Firth and the Bewley Firth, which there's 2 firths in Inverness, there's a narrow sort of waterway as the 2 firths sort of come together, and when the tide changes the water gets really turbulent there. And this picture, which was in a number of papers, it was certainly in the Times and the Daily Mail, was of 2 dolphins sort of doing the normal dolphin leap as they were playing in the water, and then there's another dolphin which is fully inverted and airborne, so it's like doing a mid-air handstand, this dolphin, in between the other 2, it's showing off. And if you just stand on the shoreline, you can watch the dolphins, probably most days actually, if you're there at the right time, when the tide changes. So Inverness is a good place to go. Just that everybody says, oh, it's going to be really cold. And if you realise how short the days are in the winter, it doesn't actually properly get dark in the summer. But it's a really, hopefully, nice place to go. But importantly, I do feel that God is placing that call on my life to be there, and to be there in answer to that call. Now, going back to the choice that we made, I think sometimes we do have those options where we're presented with one thing and another, and actually it's so tempting to go for what seems to be the safe and the easier option, thinking that we've got the option to go to the other place maybe if it suits us or if other things don't work out. And again, I think in answering God's call, we've actually got to make that decision to act for Him, to actually make the decision to be in the place and at the time when He is placing that call on your life. A year ago, when we were knowing that we were going to be asked a question, it felt really Abrahamic to say, I know that God's calling me to go somewhere, I just don't know where. Never in my head did I imagine that in feeling that way, because I did feel that way a year ago, that it would be to a place which was as far in this land as I could go, because without going to some of the outlying islands, there's nowhere else in British Methodism that I could go that was further than Inverness. The only way I could do that would be to get on another boat to go even further. But certainly travelling on the mainland, Inverness was as far as it could be. I think sometimes we do need to take that step of faith to be the people that he calls us to be. Now, it may not be as far away as Inverness, and certainly sometimes in life what is on our doorstep can be as far as Inverness, because what God leads us into sometimes, rather than geographic distance, is into a place of discomfort, into a place where it's hard to be his people, into a place where it's hard to be a light to the nations. Do you want to put the Isaiah passage up? We're going to be having communion in a short while, and one of the things which has really been on my heart, and I've got a different version of the Bible in front of me, is this passage from Isaiah. In Isaiah 42, he talks about the people of Israel being a light to the nations. But this passage, which speaks to me very deeply of what's at the heart of my faith, which is this experience of communion that I spoke about earlier. This to me is a passage about communion, because one of the prayers, again, from the Methodist worship book, and has been part of the Methodist tradition for a long time, has been talking about heavenly banquet, which is a prayer that we often say after communion. And this is how I picture the heavenly banquet. On this mountain, the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wines, of rich food filled with the marrow of well-aged wine strained clear. And he will destroy on this mountain the shroud that is cast over all peoples, the sheet which is spread over all nations. He will swallow up death forever. And Lord will wipe away the tears from all faces, and the disgrace of his people he will take away from all the earth, for the Lord has spoken. It will be said on that day, Lo, this is our God. We have waited for him, so that he might save us. This is the Lord for whom we have waited. Let us be glad and rejoice in his salvation, for the hand of the Lord will rest on this mountain, which is the last verse. He's up there. Now, all that sounds wonderful, but what you need to remember, and this ties in with what you've been doing with Daniel, is that these words from Isaiah are delivered in the midst of all the turmoil that's happening to the people of Israel. Depending on when you understand these verses were first spoken and written, they were either as a foretaste of what was coming, or in the midst of what was coming, or in the real turmoil of the aftermath of what had come. Because either the Assyrians were coming, the Babylonians were coming, they were being taken off into exile, they were being brought back and still things weren't right, and then the Persians and the Greeks and all of that, the Romans were still a long way beyond the horizon. And what this passage says about it being somewhere where all peoples, all nations will be invited, sounds absolutely wonderful until you realise that those who have been causing you all this grief, those neighbours that you don't get on with, those people who you are called to love but really don't like, they are going to be at this banquet and sitting at the Lord's table with you. And then it starts to get really tough. And when God puts his call on our lives to be a light to the nations, then actually he's calling us not in geographic distance, but sometimes into the tough areas of life where we're having to be a light in the places where we only see darkness. And that gets really tough then. But actually, it means that we end up in a place where we find real blessing, and where, because we are called to be a light to the nations, we can be a blessing. That's a wonderful thing, isn't it? Not only to find blessing, but to be a blessing. And I said at the outset, when I came here, I didn't know how comfortable I would feel here. I have rejoiced, particularly at the 1 o'clock services, in being in a place, and I've already said this to Sally and Tony, where somebody in church leadership can sit in front of a congregation eating rice out of a Tupperware, and that says to somebody else, it's okay to be who you are in this place. And I will have that picture for years of you sitting there and being invited to speak when your mouth is full and you're hoping that nobody else is noticing what you're doing. But sometimes it's when we don't realise, or we're hoping that people don't notice what we're doing, that we're making our strongest witness. And so, in the things that God's calling us to, God calls us because He has a purpose for us all. He has nothing in vain, and He loves all that He has made. And sometimes when things get tough, we need to remember that. Psalm 23 talks about preparing this table, doesn't it? In the presence of my enemies. And God's about to anoint us in that. Calling is something which is wonderful, it's hard, but it's also about blessing. And I have felt really blessed. Now, one of the things that I've shared with Tony in the conversation that we've had, I've been a little bit surprised about here. This isn't meant to be a criticism, but it's just an observation. Is that usually when you celebrate communion, it's done in a way which is very light and doesn't include what some churches might refer to as the words of institution, which refers to the passage in 1 Corinthians where Paul is talking about what happens at the Lord's Supper. Now, I'm going to read from Luke's Gospel, and for me, this is another version of it, but not the version that we would usually hear. Now, on that same day, and this is Luke 24, 2 of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them. But their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, said, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know these things that have taken place there in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him." Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, And how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory? Then beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them all the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it's almost evening, and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. Then they said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen. Indeed, he has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of bread. It's a hackneyed phrase that life is a journey. There have been all sorts of times when I've been aware of God's presence on my journey and failed to recognise him. And I think still there are times on the journey as it is now when I don't properly recognise how Jesus is calling on my life. Then there were those moments when things become clear. For me, in my conversion, that was completed in the breaking of bread. It can be clear when certain things happen in our lives. But notice that it was in that familiar thing, that breaking of bread, in the way that they'd seen it happen before, that they recognised him. But then they did the dangerous thing, because although they were prepared to let Jesus go on in one way, they were calling him back because it was dangerous. And then they went and did the dangerous thing, didn't they? They went and made a journey, because sometimes once we recognise Jesus so clearly, we do actually do the dangerous things, and we witness fully to who he is. He is our Saviour, he is our risen Lord, and he is the author of our salvation, that we may be a light to the nation and a blessing in praise of his name.